So my subject for today is the new atheism, science and human values. The new atheism, science and human values. Question mark. Is it possible to have and retain values, moral values in the worldview of the new atheism? So first of all, just to orient us a little bit, what are we talking about when we talk about the new atheism? What is it really about, and who are some of the key figures behind it? Well, in the last 15 years or so, there has been a group of scientists and philosophers who've been given very much a media platform, a public platform, to promote naturalistic evolutionary ideas and to position these in a very antagonistic way toward what we might call biblical faith, and in particular Christianity. And it's been dubbed the new atheism. A whole bunch of fairly ill-considered paperbacks have come out from these authors. I've read a number of them. And they have had a certain amount of influence in the university environment, and to some degree also in at the popular level. So you don't have to be in a university to hear some of these names come up with friends and neighbors and colleagues, because they appear on popular television shows and so on. Now, the ideas that they're propagating are not essentially new. There's nothing particularly new about this atheism. It's a regurgitation of very old ideas, but the vociferousness of their approach and the tone whereby they tackle these issues in these public discussions has changed somewhat the nature of those discussions in the public space. There's a lot of ranting going on. In fact, a friend of mine, Dr. Jonathan Safety, who's a Christian apologist, he's called it pathological atheism because of the kind of rabid dogmatism with which they approach these discussions. And the primary target is, of course, Christianity. They may make the odd comment about Islam or Judaism periodically, but the primary target is Christianity. You may have heard of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse. These are perhaps the four most well-known of the new atheists. There are others, but these are the most well-known. That's Richard Dawkins there in the top left. He's at Oxford. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. He's an animal behaviorist. He's pretty elderly now, recently had a heart attack. Sam Harris underneath him, he's a younger guy, neuroscientist, popular writer. He's written a couple of influential books. One was called The Moral Landscape, the other was called Waking Up. And then there's Daniel Dennett on the top right. He's a popular science writer, Breaking the Spell and Consciousness Explained, which is exactly what that book didn't do. And then Christopher Hitchens, who's now deceased, he was very much an atheist apologist and a popularizer. His most famous book, I think, was God is Not Great. So some of you will have heard of these people, or at least one or two of them. And as a broad generalization, they reject religion, in inverted commas. That's what they say. They claim to reject religion because modern science has supposedly demystified the world for educated people. Modern science has supposedly demystified the world for educated people, and so any discussions about a transcendent God, the God of the Bible, are contemptible. They're beneath contempt. They are irrelevant, and they are not worthy of consideration by serious people. That would be their position. It's just simply not worth considering. Belief in the God of Scripture is variously dismissed by these writers as a delusion, hence the God delusion, a brain virus, memes, as Richard Dawkins calls them, a mental illness, and although they have trouble justifying these categories, evil and dangerous to believe in such a God. That's where they are coming from. In this vein, the philosopher John Searle, looks like a miserable fellow, doesn't he? He says, the result of this demystification is that we have gone beyond atheism to a point where the issue, that is God's existence, no longer matters in the way it did to earlier generations. So he's trying to say there that, okay, this subject, God's existence, this Christian God, was of interest to earlier generations, but not anymore. We've gone beyond that. We're beyond that now. It just doesn't matter anymore. Now, these, I would claim, are both arrogant and naive declarations, but they're made because of a belief that the scientific method and the evolutionary hypothesis, the materialist evolutionary hypothesis, has explained enough of reality to make the question of God no longer relevant, no longer important. So what exactly is the foundation of this claim? That's a sort of 10,000-foot view of what the new atheists are saying. What's the foundation of the new atheism from a worldview standpoint? Well, actually, these views about the world are, despite their protestations to the contrary, profoundly religious. And that's what I'm going to hopefully show you over the next 40 minutes. Grounded in an anti-theistic worldview, which is taken on faith. It's a belief system. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the new atheism, especially when you're responding to it or combating it, is to explain and show how it's a belief system. For the media-hungry cosmologist Lawrence Krauss, for example, he declared, maybe I can't prove there's no God, but I wouldn't want to live in a universe with one. Well, I can actually give a word of comfort to Lawrence there, because he doesn't live in a universe with one anyway. There's an elementary misunderstanding there. God doesn't live in the universe. Now, he is active in it. His presence can be manifest in it. His power is seen in it. He doesn't live in it. But of course, he was trying to say he just doesn't want to believe in that kind of God. Thomas Nagel, who is a more circumspect American philosopher, very well-known philosopher, wrote a very good book, interesting book, I should say, called Mind and Cosmos, a few years ago. He says that his rejection of God, he says in Mind and Cosmos, is based on an ungrounded assumption of my own. So he acknowledges that it's a belief system. It's an ungrounded assumption of my own. There's these new atheist zealots then are actually in the grip, and I'll come to Stephen Weinberg in a moment, of a religious view that involves conflating, bringing together the empirical methods of natural science, that's observation and testing, with confusing them or conflating them with the worldview of atheistic materialism. So they look at a tool, empirical investigation, and then they conflate that tool with a worldview. So the tools of science, empirical investigation, can be put into the service of any number of worldviews. Stephen Weinberg makes this confusion very clear. He says the worldview of science is rather chilling. Not only do we not find any point to life laid out for us in nature, no objective basis for our moral principles, no correspondence between what we think is the moral law and the laws of nature, but the emotions that we most treasure, our love for our wives and husbands and children, are made possible by chemical processes in our brains that are what they are as a result of natural selection acting on chance mutations over millions of years. Living without God isn't easy, but it's very difficult. He offers one other consolation, that there is a certain honor or perhaps a grim satisfaction in facing up to our condition without despair and without wishful thinking, with good humor, but without God. Well, if you're not used to listening to philosophy, I know that sounds a bit involved. What he's basically saying is, look, the worldview of science means that we detect no purpose, no meaning, no value, and this basically means that all the things we treasure the most and think are most important in our lives are basically just the result of deterministic physical processes and forces. And it doesn't mean anything, there's no purpose in it, we just have to stare at that abyss and say, well, there's a certain courage that we need to face that with good humour and without God. And he speaks explicitly of the worldview of science, but what he actually means is naturalism, materialism, naturalistic evolutionism is what he means. But the empirical method of science is not a worldview. Observation and testing is not a worldview. It's a theoretical means of investigating measurable phenomena in a repeatable, testable way so that we can reach generalized conclusions. And those generalized conclusions are always being updated. So let's say a scientist is going to investigate the color of swans. And he investigates as best as he can where swans are living, and he observes those swans, and he notes in his notebook, his science notebook, through observation and testing, swans are white. Well, what is required for his whole thesis to be pulled down? Simply that one day another scientist, while he's out bird watching, notices that there's a black swan just flown onto the lake. So it's always being revised, it's always being updated. So theories and hypotheses that we come up with because of observation and testing do not provide a worldview. Thomas Nagel, who I mentioned already, he says that with respect to this evolutionary worldview, he says it's an assumption governing the scientific project rather than a well-confirmed scientific hypothesis. That's a very important statement. He says it's an assumption governing the scientific project rather than a well-confirmed scientific hypothesis. In other words, this is a belief, this is a worldview that is ruling the project, the investigation of the scientist. It's not even a scientific hypothesis. He doesn't even give it... This is an atheist, by the way. He doesn't give the evolutionary worldview, materialistic evolutionism, he doesn't even give it the credit of being a theory. He says it's not even a well-confirmed scientific hypothesis. Sometimes you'll hear people say, who come from this perspective, because they've read it on the back of a cereal box or seen something on TV, is they'll say that, well, you know, the only kind of reliable knowledge, the only reliable truth that we can ever reach is that which is scientifically testable and empirically verifiable. So unless you can show me by science that such and such is true, well, I won't believe it. Well, of course, there's a major problem with that perspective, and that is that the statement itself, the belief itself, that only scientifically and empirically justified beliefs can be trusted, is not an empirically verified, scientifically justified belief. That's a worldview, and it's a philosophy that then is governing investigation. So there's no avoiding worldview starting points and religious philosophical perspectives, which actually rest on faith knowledge. These beliefs are, by definition, outside the scope of the scientific method. They can't be confirmed either way in terms of the scientific method, the natural sciences. Now, let's talk about science for a minute. Let's talk about the nature of science. So we've seen who these new atheists are. We've seen that there's a worldview foundation underneath this new atheism. It's not just hard-boiled science. It's a worldview. Let's think about the nature of science for a moment. There are all kinds of sciences. Some of you probably studied them in university. Maybe you certainly would have had a smattering of them in school. There's philosophy and logic and physics and biology and chemistry and sociology and mathematics and geology and psychology and physiology and all kinds of other ologies. And that's how we divide up university departments. Now, these are theoretical disciplines which investigate or analyze different created aspects of reality, that is, what we might call meaning sides of reality. So, for example, mathematicians investigate the numerical side of reality. The physicist is investigating the physical side or energetic side of reality. The biologist is looking at the biotic or organic side of reality. The psychologist is investigating the sensitive or emotional side of reality. The philosopher and logician is looking at the logical side, and so on. This is how we have recognized these divisions in the universities. Now, these sciences all presuppose the givenness of meaning in created reality. In other words, there's a givenness to the world. And now, for example, when you came here today, I strongly suspect you didn't go through multiple calculations, mathematical calculations about how you were going to get here. I suspect you didn't see a psychologist before you got here to ask how you should, analyze the speaker's psychological state of mind. You've been using, hopefully, your logical distinguishing faculty as you've been listening to various talks during the conference so far. But you've come here in terms of everyday, ordinary experience that you don't think about theoretically most of the time, most of your life. You get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you get dressed. You're not doing a theoretical investigation of reality 99.9% of the time. You're living in the world as a given that for you is meaningful, it's full of meaning. Okay, now, that world, in order to do science, is always accepted as a given by the scientist. When you start analyzing it, you have to have that given world with an intelligible order that's the coherent, everyday experience of ordinary life. The problem is Western philosophy has made ordinary life a philosophical problem. They've tried to say that ordinary human experience, they call it naive experience, is a philosophical problem. The naive experience, our ordinary everyday experience, isn't a philosophical problem. The problems only come when we try and look at the different sides of created reality to try and analyze them, but then we find mystery confronting us. Now, some of the sciences are about analyzing everyday phenomena, understanding the functions of things in reality. Ted here is a doctor, he sees people in the surgery, he's interested in understanding the function of the human body, especially the heart. And then some sciences are about the past. Geology, archaeology, to some degree, elements in anthropology, paleontology, and so forth. And there is actually a really important, obvious distinction which some of the new atheists just seem to overlook when we think about science. There are operational sciences. So people think, well, science really, it's, here's my MacBook Air. Science works. Science gives you real answers about the world. Yes, but this isn't operational science. Right? This is technology. It's operational science. Testable, repeatable. The historical sciences, though, are trying to build a hypothetical picture about the past, which is not repeatable or testable in the same way. How could you repeat the origin of the universe? How could you test that? Or so-called chemical evolution. How would you go about testing that? They've actually said there's not even an imaginary pathway to life from non-life. In addition, think about this, belief that the universe began without a cause, which means without a reason, because when we're talking about causes, what caused something, we're looking for a reason for something. The belief that the universe began without a cause, that nothing created everything, and that we are cosmic stardust which coagulated into some sort of primordial slime and evolved consciousness and rationality by material forces alone. That's called abiogenesis. Abiogenesis. That's a religious worldview. It's not an operational science. It's not even a historical science. It's a religious worldview. This is illustrated pretty well for us in the difference between functional biology, which is an operational science, and evolutionary biology, which is a worldview masquerading as historical science. This is what Dr. Mark Kirschner, Harvard Medical School, pointed out. Over the past 100 years, almost all of biology has proceeded independent of evolution, except evolutionary biology itself. Molecular biology, biochemistry, and physiology have not taken evolution into account at all. If the evolutionary worldview that the new atheists rely on was necessary for science and is a foundational scientific truth, this progress in these areas of biology, molecular biology and so forth, would not have been possible. So it would be important to, having considered the nature of science, what about the origins of what we call the modern scientific method in the West? What about the origins of the modern scientific method in the West? Well, they do not have atheistic roots. They don't have roots in the thinking of the atheists. Social historian Rodney Stark has shown what is today recognized by most professional historians, that there was no such thing as the scientific revolution produced in the so-called Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, just like the so-called Dark Ages, was an intellectual era constructed and labelled by a group of 18th century philosophers who wanted to discredit Christianity to establish secular humanism amongst the elite. The Enlightenment, the Christian era, was called the Dark Ages. But the reality is this, with respect to the scientific pioneers of the 16th and 17th century, 25% were members of the clergy, 60% of the great scientists of the era were devout Christians, and the rest were conventional Christian believers. 2% of the founders of what we call modern science were skeptics. 2%. As such, Rodney Stark notes, he says in his book, How the West Won, he says, clearly the superb scientific achievements of the 16th and 17th centuries were the work not of skeptics, but of Christian men. The era of the Enlightenment is as imaginary as the era of the Dark Ages, both myths perpetrated by the same people for the same reasons. So what Stark actually shows is that Christianity was essential for the coming of age of Western science, which is why it was a Western phenomenon. It arose in Christian Europe because only Christian Europe believed the things that promoted its emergence. And this is really important when discussing the origin of science. The basis of their belief was their image of God and his creation. The English skeptical philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, he acknowledged begrudgingly that Christianity was essential to the rise of science because, and I quote, that because of the medieval insistence on the rationality of God, conceived as with the personal energy of Jehovah and with the rationality of a Greek philosopher, every detail was supervised and ordered. The search into nature could only result in the vindication of faith in rationality. Now, I recognize that there is an excessive rationalism in that statement, and there was an excessive rationalism in many of the 17th, 18th, and 19th century thinkers who were Christian. But they did believe in a personal, purposeful God who created a world of law and structure that's ordered, it's logically intelligible, and so empirical investigation, testing is possible, and it was useful for deepening knowledge. And that's why they went about the developments that we saw and have seen in the sciences. An impersonal, fatalistic, irrational conception of reality could not give rise to modern science, and didn't, as world history shows. The science that the new atheists celebrate and its technological achievements requires you to believe certain things about the universe before you can speak of the scientific method. And interestingly, none of these beliefs are justified by any brand of atheism. No brand of atheism is able to provide the foundational worldview that allows for the intelligibility of the scientific method. If the world, for example, is not created, if it has no design, no law, order, or purpose, it's an eternal mystery. And actually, that's, interestingly enough, exactly what some of these new atheists say about it. It's just a mystery. It's unpredictable. It's arbitrary. Because in principle, these uncreated brute facts of reality are impervious to theoretical and scientific analysis. Let me illustrate that for you, because I know this is a bit abstract, especially after lunch on Saturday. What is happening is thought is being reduced, human thinking is being reduced to abstract ideas in your brain, which is a chemical accident, and it's somehow being brought into relationship to the unrelated particulars outside of your brain. And the question is, how is that possible? Let me illustrate it for you this way. Do you remember before there was Nintendo and Xbox and all of that, there were connect-the-dot puzzles? And that's what we used to do in the car. Now this one actually gives you quite a lot of help, because there are numbers next to the dots, and there's also a bit of some of the surroundings have been pre-prepared by the author. But how does it connect-the-dot puzzle work? It works because it can look like just a sea of dots on a page with no apparent relationship to each other. But the goal of it is that a child takes a crayon, and in connecting the dots in the right order, the pre-established relationship between the dots emerges so that the meaning is discovered. You discover. So it's a house, it's a car, it's, in this case I think probably a horse. There's a horse. And they start to recognize shapes and discover a meaning that's already there. Why does a connect-the-dot puzzle work like that? Because there's an author. So instead of just seeing a sea of unrelated dots on a page, when you connect them, the meaning is discovered. Now, the atheistic worldview, imagine there were no numbers next to those dots, and imagine there was no relationship pre-established between the dots. Then you would just be running around with a pencil any which way you like, because there is no design, no purpose, no plan, there's no pre-established relationship between any of the facts. They are brute facts, which means they are impervious to interpretation. Now, you can say, well, I'm going to join the dots how I want to, and you join the dots how you want to, and you lot join the dots how you want to, and we can all go and live our imaginary world. We'll pretend the world has meaning. And that's effectively what New Atheism ends in. We'll all go and pretend the world has the meaning that any particular individual wants to give it. We don't determine this order you see in the sciences, we discover it. What Albert Einstein said, a priori, that's before experience, one should expect a chaotic world which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. Now, he said that as a pantheistic skeptic. He said on his worldview, on his religious perspective on the world, before actually coming to it as a scientist, he would expect a chaotic world which cannot be grasped by the mind in any way. He said the mystery, the big mystery, is how true knowledge can expand through the explanatory power of reasoning and science. It was for him a miracle and a mystery. That's what he called it. As far back as the ancient Greeks, Aristotle denied that the universe came into being, and so the ancients often treated the cosmos as a mysterious living thing. A mysterious living thing. Natural phenomena sometimes occurred in their view because of motive, like the universe itself had a motive. Actually, you hear a lot of modern pagans talking like this all the time. I remember seeing Jim Carrey saying thank you for an award he'd just been given a few years ago and thanking the universe. As though, you know, the universe somehow purposed it. This view was revived actually by the German philosopher Schopenhauer, who said everything is will. Everything is will. We haven't got time to talk about that. We'll be here all day. So, pagan views often deified the natural world, deified it, and couldn't bring about the birth of modern science. In fact, Stark shows, he says, none of Aristotle's work constituted science because his explanations were not linked to systematic observations. He failed to recognize such tests were relevant. I mean, even the boiling point of water, and whether heavy objects would fall faster than lighter objects, he didn't get right because he never actually went and tested them. Why would you in a pagan worldview? Science arose in the West, and only in the West, precisely because the Judeo-Christian conception of God encouraged and even demanded its pursuit. And yet Sam Harris refers to faith-based religion, by which he means Christianity, as that great engine of ignorance and bigotry. The same faith that gave him modern science, that he lauds, he attacks the very faith perspective, the very worldview that, ironically, provided the presuppositions that birthed the science that he practically worships. So what this actually comes down to, we've thought about the nature of science, we've talked about the origins of the science, is that these new atheists, and all those actually, everybody in the world, frankly, has a divinity belief. And this is critically important if you want to respond in any way in conversation to the new atheism or to people of any particular religion, as a matter of fact. It's important to expose and highlight the actual character of their belief system. Everyone is religious, and religion involves divinity beliefs. What do I mean by a divinity belief? I don't mean that you have to believe in a God or a personal God. I mean that by a divinity belief, any non-dependent reality upon which all else depends in our thinking, any non-dependent reality upon which everything else depends in our thinking is a divinity belief. It's easy to break down. There are three basic divinity concepts. That's all. There is the biblical Christian theistic view that the divine, that upon which everything depends, is God, the living God. Now, this is copied, of course, in Judaism and Islamic thought, which has critical problems in the way they conceive it. We haven't got time to talk about that now. But essentially, God's being is not the being of creation. That's the critical distinction. God's being is not the being of creation. God is self-existent, he's non-dependent, everything else depends on him. And this diagram hopefully illustrates that for you. Here's the non-dependent, uncreated God. Here's the dependent creation. This is the direction of activity. Right? This is the direction both of God's word, but also this is the created laws which ultimately bind and govern creation itself. So it's not a deistic conception of God, where there's no connection between God and the creation. He's involved, his law, his word governs it. But he can't be identified with the universe. The second view is pagan, the pagan view. The divine is part of the world of creation, some aspect, some element, some force, some principle in the universe. So instead of there being a discontinuity basic to reality, of God distinct from the world, there is a basic continuity to all things. So some portion of creation is divine. It's that which is why it's illustrated with the unbroken circle. There's something within creation itself that is divine. Of course, in ancient paganism, various gods were worshipped as divine. Sometimes, a lot of paganism didn't posit gods, personified gods, but some of them did. And the gods themselves were within the universe. So non-divine things are, on this view, partly divine because everything is permeated by the divine. The third view is pantheistic. And this is found, of course, in Buddhism and Hinduism, and this view recognizes only one reality, the divine. And the reason we have a broken circle in here is that there are what appears to be non-divine, created to us, to our normal perception, is in fact actually part of the divine. We just don't realize it. We don't appreciate it. So there is only one divine reality, and all distinctions are maya, they are an illusion. And it's that illusion that causes suffering and so on. Then you have the Buddhist philosophy. Now these worldviews, interestingly, are very relevant to the discussion of new atheism, because their ultimate view of reality is determining in advance what their science must conclude about the world. This is why it's so important. Your ultimate view of reality is going to determine in advance what your science concludes about the world. It guides your view of reality and then shapes your scientific or theoretical thinking. The new atheists have actually variously adopted pagan and pantheistic divinity concepts. So Sam Harris, for example, seems to bounce between paganism and pantheism in his books. So if you read his book, The Moral Landscape, he assumes a pagan view. You read his book a little later, his later work, Waking Up, he reveals that he's a Buddhist. He's a new atheist, but he's a Buddhist. And he's been seeking cessation. What is cessation? He's been on all kinds of pilgrimages, these trips, with yogis and gurus, to try and meditate over a period of months to gain the realization that all is in fact one, and that all distinctions, even the distinction of the self, you as an individual, as a person, as an individual person, as a distinct identity, is an illusion. And he actually argues in his book that he did experience this momentarily. That he kind of had this moment of seeing through reality to realize that all is one. He promotes this atheistic spirituality, of which the deepest goal, he says, is freedom from the illusion of self. The deepest answers may have to come directly from consciousness. Directly from consciousness. So now he's saying, at this point, well, it's not going to be the hard natural sciences that give us the deepest answers. It's going to be directly our consciousness itself, as it meditates on ultimate reality. Where do these divinity concepts find their counterpart? To what are they tied? What are they tied to? Well, it's the origin of these different views in paganism and in pantheism is reductionism. Reductionism, there's an important word. Reductionism. Everyone believes something has independent existence, something on which everything else depends. That's what I've argued. And that belief is a religious choice. Not a scientific conclusion, not a theoretical conclusion, it's a religious choice. And it comes about, the reason that people will look at creation and then try and find something there to take the place of divinity is because when you experience the world as a human being, we discover that it has all of these different properties. It has all these different qualities. So take a chair, for example. There's a quantitative, mathematical aspect to a chair. And we see there's 4 legs on the chair. It's made up of various parts that we can number. There's a spatial aspect to the chair, so it has extension in space. It's not just a mathematical idea, it's a spatial thing. There's a kinematic aspect, which means there's a movement aspect to it, because the planet is spinning right now, and all the atoms in that chair are moving around and bouncing around. And you can move the chair around, put it in different places in the room. There's a physical aspect to it. It's solid to the touch. There's a biotic element to many chairs, if they're not made of purely man-made fabrics. If you've got a leather chair or a wooden chair, it's been cut down from a tree, made from the hide of an animal, and so on. There's a sensory aspect to it because we can perceive it, we can see it, we can touch it. Hopefully you don't chew on a chair so that you can taste it, but I guess you could. There's a logical aspect to it because we can differentiate one chair from another, and we can differentiate chairs from other things in the room. And on. I can talk about all kinds of other properties, but I can see you're already glazing over. So the point here, though, is to say that then when we look at all of those different qualities of things, we discover that they're governed by laws. So there are logical laws and physical laws and mathematical laws and so on, and we can actually discover them. So when people are intent on rejecting the living God of Scripture, they go to creation itself and they try and find amongst the properties of creation a substitute divinity. Now, interestingly enough, this is exactly what the Apostle Paul says is done in Romans chapter 1. He says they worship and serve the creature, something created, rather than the Creator who is blessed forever. So they exchange the truth about God for the lie. And they worship and serve the creature. They take something created and they put it in the position of God. Think about when Paul was preaching in Athens, gosh, my time's almost gone, to the philosophers about the Creator and resurrected Lord in Acts chapter 17. And some of his audience were Epicureans, we're told. Luke tells us in the book of Acts. They were Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Who were the Epicureans? Well, they were pagans. They were materialists. They were like the new atheists of the first century. And they believed that only atoms of matter and space are self-existent. Everything depends, they believed, on atoms. Now, they didn't conceive conceptually of the atom like we do today. That's our current theory of the atom. Just portrayed on there. But they had this basic idea of discrete particles. Everything depended on it. The Pythagoreans said, no, numbers are self-existent. Everything depends on numbers. They actually believed there was an eternal world of numbers. In the case of materialism, both ancient and modern, all reality then is reduced to being purely physical, and all non-physical realities depend on purely physical ones. So either all reality is simply physical, or at least it's physical, and anything that's non-physical totally depends on the physical. The technical term is epiphenomenal. It's a byproduct of the physical. That's all. So physical reality is then given a divine status. Now, you can do that exercise of reductionism with any aspect of reality, and you can try and reduce all of reality to one of its aspects, and somehow try and account for everything in terms of one element, one aspect, and pretty much most things have been tried. And you end up in hopeless contradictions and antinomies when you do. From an apologetic standpoint, if you try and reduce everything to the organic or biotic, you end up with vitalism and evolutionism. The logical, you get Hegel's view of reality. The rational is the real, he said. The rational is the real. If you deify the feeling or sensitive aspect, you end up with the idea, as David Hume said, that we're just a bundle of sensations. Or, where the German philosopher Schopenhauer ended up, just saying everything is just will, everything is will. But actually, you can't even think of any created aspect of reality in isolation from the rest. Can you actually conceive of what it would mean for anything to be exclusively physical in isolation from what is non-physical? As a Christian philosopher, Roy Clauser, he says, what is left of the idea of sense perception when it's deprived of all connection to number, space, matter, and logic? What is left of logic if there's nothing non-logical to which it can apply it? Even its famous axiom of non-contradiction says that nothing can be true and false at the same time and in the same sense. Thus, it includes an essential reference to both time and to other senses, properties to which it applies. Anybody familiar with the law of non-contradiction? Something can't be true and false, be true at the same time and in the same sense. It can't be true and false at the same time and in the same sense. So you even can't think about logic purely just in terms of an abstract law. It's always related to time and sense. So you can't reduce creation, in short, to any one single aspect of it. Here's a little illustration of that for you, if this works. It may not. I'm not going to hang around with that. So I was going to show you a little clip there of John Cleese, the English comedian, sending this whole reductionism up. And hang on one second, let me just see if it can... No, it doesn't want to do it. Quick while I'm behind. Anyway, what he basically does is he says these are supposedly all different genes, and he says we've discovered the gene for people believing in God, a gene for people not believing in God, and so on and so forth, for all these different kinds of beliefs. It shows how this kind of reductionism is totally absurd. I'm kind of frustrated that hasn't worked because it really is quite good.
Can you go back for a second? But like,
can I?
Can you exit out to the PowerPoint on that video? So like when you have the PowerPoint slides like on the side.
When it was like this?
Yeah, and then enable content in the top right.
Oh, well spotted. There we go. Thank you.
Hello. We scientists have now located a gene which we scientists believe gives people the need to believe in God. In other words, this God gene releases chemicals into our body which create the impression that there is meaning in the universe. And this God gene is just here, between the gene which we scientists now know makes us eat coconut ice cream after a fish dinner, and this gene here, which causes people with weak egos to grasp around desperately for simple explanations. Now, the discovery of this God gene is a big step forward in our quest to show that every bit of human behavior can be explained away mechanically, because we've now also located the gene which makes some people believe that every piece of human behavior can be explained away mechanically, and it's here, right next to the gene that makes you go to see Nicolas Cage movies, so that's puzzle solved, and right under this gene, which can cause you to forget that since the 1920s, quantum physics has destroyed forever the idea that everything can be explained mechanically. Now, the gene which causes us to forget this obvious fact is very dominant in some people, especially me. And we scientists now know that it's closely linked to this gene here, which gives you such a weak sense of self that you hang on to anything that makes you feel more secure emotionally, whether it's fundamentalist religion or a reductionist view of the universe, which is right over this gene here that makes you want to punch people in the head when they take the scientific process and subject it to their pathological literal-mindedness. Thank you. I did. And by the way, we now know that there is a gene that causes you to say, thank you, I needed that, just there, when you're punched in the head.
So you get the point. Maybe I should have played that and then we could have had Q&A. So the physical sciences then, Thomas Nagel says, which holds that everything in the world is physical, that everything that happens in the world has its most basic explanation, whether we can come to know it or not, in physical law as applied to physical things, events, and their constituents. That basic idea He says the physical sciences will not enable us to understand the irreducibly subjective centers of consciousness that are such a conspicuous part of the world. So, actually, Roy Clauser has pointed out, he says that the truth is, oh, where are we now? Thinking of atheism in terms as the reverse of religion is narrowly culture bound. It reflects the fact that the religions Western people are familiar with denounce materialism. But the truth is there have long been religions in which matter is believed to be divine, and theories they form the basis for constructing explanations. So let me just conclude with this, and just see how this applies in the area of values. What happens to values if you take this physicalism of the new atheists? What happens to morality? What happens to the ideas of good and evil? Well, Harris basically says morality and values depend on the existence of conscious minds, that's interesting, and specifically on the fact that such minds experience various forms of well-being and suffering in this universe. And he basically argues morality and values depend only on conscious human minds, so there's nothing that transcends the mind. These minds are fully constrained by physical law as natural phenomenon. So there you've got the destruction of the concept of mind altogether, because you've just got brains constrained by natural physical laws. And then he goes on, these laws of nature are as yet unknown. He says, he argues they're indeterminate, yet everything must be reduced to them and brought under the control of the physical sciences. So even though he says we don't really know what those physical laws are, we've got to reduce everything to them, which is a contradiction. We can't reduce things to something we don't even know what we're talking about. And the language of well-being and suffering can replace or alter the meaning of the moral, metaphysical language of good and evil, right and wrong. So what Sam Harris does in his book, The Moral Landscape, is he tries to redefine good and evil in terms of the ideas of well-being and suffering. Good is well-being, which is analogous, he says, to health. You can draw an analogy with health. And evil is when it is suffering. When any conscious organism suffers. That's his basic idea. But of course, this reduces everything to a kind of inner subjectivity. People's sense of well-being or a sense of suffering are totally subjective. And how can we know that what something truly is? Until we know what something truly is and its purpose, we can't speak of its well-being or its suffering. We can't speak of health or disease with respect to it. The new atheists believe that existence precedes essence, which simply means there is no defined human nature. There's no normative idea of the human person. There's just evolution. The universe is in constant flux, constant change. And so the very idea of health actually depends on knowing what the normative condition of a human being is. If you go to the doctor, like Ted, and you say, I'm having pains in my chest, he's the heart doctor, he has to have some idea of what the normative parameters of a functioning human heart are before he can say your heart's unhealthy. So until you have a norm, you can't measure well-being. Until you have purpose, the purpose of the functioning of something, you can't even define suffering or well-being with respect to it. What Sam Harris does by kind of sleight of hand is he says the good is global well-being. That's the good. And the bad, the evil, is any kind of suffering. And the closer you are to global well-being, the better we can say, and the more important somebody's life is, actually. We can deem their way of life and their life as more important. But who determines what global well-being is? Who defines what global well-being is? Do we accept what the different atheists have a different idea of what global well-being constitutes? Some of them disagree about whether that well-being is for just human beings, or for all conscious, sentient beings. So for some atheists, humans are a virus infecting the planet, and the best thing for the well-being of humanity would be that the vast majority of human beings went extinct. Others don't agree with that amongst the atheists. So which one is it? Or what about the Muslims? They believe that global well-being means Islam and Sharia law. The Buddhist thinks that the problem for well-being is that we have the illusion that there's an indifference to suffering in Buddhism, because suffering is an illusion. You're only suffering because you believe that there are distinctions which are in fact unreal. And that's the cause of your suffering. So global well-being is recognizing that absolute oneness, and so forth. You can talk about Marxists, communists, National Socialists, capitalism, utopianism, libertarianism, all with their different visions of global well-being. So who gets to determine it? It's very interesting that when Sam Harris finally gets around to defining his view, the most powerful societies on Earth spend their time debating issues like gay marriage when they should be focused on problems like nuclear proliferation, genocide, energy security, climate change, poverty, and failing schools. Progressive liberalism, in other words. If our well-being depends upon the interaction between events in our brains and events in the world, and that there are better and worse ways to secure it, then some cultures will tend to produce lives that are more worth living than others. So if you agree with Sam's view of global well-being, your life is really worth living, and that's a better culture. If you don't, well, according to his earlier book, The End of Faith, he says, and I quote, "The link between belief and behavior raises the stakes considerably. Some propositions are so dangerous that it may be ethical to kill people for believing them. This may seem an extraordinary claim, but it merely enunciates an ordinary fact about the world in which we live." So in other words, it just becomes the values of the most powerful, those in political power, who then will define global well-being and then enforce that scientifically upon the rest of us. G.K. Chesterton said, "The man who thinks without proper first principles, with the right worldview, in other words, goes mad. Thinking in isolation and with pride ends in being an idiot. Every man who does not have a softening of the heart must at the last have a softening of the brain." And this is really where we are with the new atheism that tries to reduce moral values to physicalism. And with its destruction of moral values, with its physicalism, it destroys the mind, it destroys thinking, it destroys reasoning, because all of our behaviors can be traced back simply to these biological events in the brain that suddenly spring into view from nowhere. And this is the point I think I'd encourage you to make when you're debating with atheists, with those who believe they are these non-religious, hard-boiled scientific people, is to demonstrate their destruction of science, their destruction of reason, and their destruction of value on the basis of their own worldview. Actually, the destruction of the justice system, and actually Sam Harris acknowledges that his view of the human person would destroy the justice system. He actually says that men and women on death row have some combination of bad genes, bad parents, bad ideas, bad luck. Which of these qualities exactly were they responsible for? In fact, it seems immoral not to recognize just how much luck is involved in morality. So you have the destruction of the intelligibility of human experience. Now, I was supposed to leave 15 minutes for questions, and with all my technical problems and my other social problems, generally speaking, I was unable to do that. So I'm going to hang around here well, I've got 2 minutes actually for questions. I'll try and take 1 or 2 questions, and then I'll just hang around here. Don't forget, we've got all kinds of resources upstairs, and I will go up to our stand, our booth, and I'll be there to chat with you as well. But are there 1 or 2 questions that I can answer in the space of 2 minutes here, or respond to? Or have I sufficiently answered everybody's questions about new atheism? Oh, John Cleese did, anyway. Is there 1 question? Anybody going to be brave enough to ask a question? Yes, sir.
What about the idea that evolution has caused us to do things for the good of the world?
Yeah. Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I didn't have time to cite it, but Thomas Nagel, he says this. I'll just pull it up on the screen for you. He says, "The real badness of pain and the ability to recognize that badness are completely superfluous in a Darwinian explanation of our aversion to pain." So far as natural selection is concerned, pain could perfectly well be in itself good and pleasure in itself bad, or more likely, both of them in themselves value less. From a Darwinian perspective, our impressions of value, if constructed realistically, are completely groundless. And if that is true of our most basic responses, it is also true for the entire elaborate structure of value and morality that is built up around them by practical reflection and cultural development. So he's saying that the evolutionary story is indifferent, totally indifferent to the idea of value. Pain, suffering, anything. There's a radical indifference to the evolutionary model to any sort of human value. So the idea, I've heard atheists say just that, well, maybe there's a selective advantage. Well, maybe there is, but that doesn't make wouldn't make them values to which we're obligated to obey, would it? I mean, is the human species privileged in some way, or singled out in some way to survive on the evolutionary world and life view? Why would the human species have any more right to survive than bacteria? So on the evolutionary, there's a radical indifference to any idea of value. And if you said that altruism confers some kind of survival advantage, well, Nagel's saying he doesn't see how that's possible. It could be the absolute opposite. There's no way that that could generate any sort of transcultural, abiding, objective value that anybody is obligated to. I mean, at the end of the day, survival of the fittest would mean that those who can pass on their genes most effectively are doing, that's advancing their well-being and the well-being of their posterity. Well, that would mean that the right thing to do ethically for a man would be to sow your oats as widely as possible, and if there weren't enough takers, then there would be an evolutionary justification for rape and coercion and so on, which actually some evolutionists have argued for.